welcome everybody to our first track on the global economy today at this conference. I'm Devin Banerjee, the Senior Financial Services Editor at LinkedIn. I want to start by thanking the organizers of this event for such a fantastic job and such a stellar lineup of subject matter experts today to address the almost 15,000 attendees of this conference. We've had some just phenomenal speakers so far this morning and a fantastic slate coming up for you. Over the course of this hour, we have 4 speakers joining us. Each of them is going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes distilling the top trends that they are watching most closely as it relates to the global economy. We'll get into their outlooks for the new year as well as we approach that new year in just a couple of weeks. And the speakers also represent different areas of the global economy, both geographically and in terms of their focus. And I will introduce each of them before they begin. So we are going to start with some remarks from Mark Zandi. Mark is the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, where he directs economic research. Dr. Zandi he's a trusted advisor to policymakers and an influential source of economic analysis for business leaders, journalists, and the public. He's the author of Paying the Price, Ending the Great Recession and Beginning a New American Century, which provides an assessment of the monetary and fiscal policy response to the Great Recession. And I'm sure he has many lessons from that research and of course, all of his subject matter expertise that are applicable today. So Mark, we're going to begin with you and I'm going to turn it over to you and I'll be back in about 15 minutes to pose some questions to you as well. Take it away.
Thanks, Devin. It's a pleasure. Thanks for that great introduction. It's very kind of you. And thanks for the opportunity to speak to the group today. And I want to thank you for the 2 hours to speak. No, only kidding. Nothing worse than an economist for more than 10 to 15 minutes. So I'll keep it to that. And my task is to give you a sense of the near-term outlook for the global economy. And I'll make 3 points in my remarks. First point, the most optimistic point, and probably the point that I have the most confidence in is 2021 will be a much better year for the global economy than 2020. Now, obviously 2020 was a pretty rotten year. Global GDP, that's the value of all the things that we produce, fell about 4%. In 2020. That's an incredibly severe economic downturn. Just to give you context, if you go back to the financial crisis back a little over a decade ago, in the worst of that, we were down about a percentage point or 2 globally. So by that measure, GDP, this downturn is about 3 or 4 times more severe than what we experienced in the financial crisis. But if everything sticks roughly to script, then I expect the economy to gain some traction here. And for the calendar year 2021, I expect global GDP to be up at least 4%. So we should have a much better year. This optimistic perspective is based on 2 key assumptions. The first and the most obvious is that I do expect the COVID-19 pandemic to wind down over the course of 2021. Now, obviously, it's still raging in many parts of the world and doing a lot of economic damage, and I'll come back to that in a minute or two. But I do think, given the progress that's now evident with the development of various vaccines and the prospects that those vaccines are going to start being rolled out in the next few weeks, that by the end of the year, we should see roughly a third of the population in advanced economies inoculated by year's end. For context, in the United States, that means roughly 75 million Americans will have been inoculated by year end 2021. And then when you also consider the large numbers of people who've already been infected and hopefully have developed some antibodies, I do think in much of the advanced world, we will be approaching herd immunity by the end of 2021. Now, it's going to take longer for all that to happen in the emerging world. Obviously, the healthcare systems are not nearly as good, and getting vaccines distributed and adopted broadly is going to take some time. So that we won't see the pandemic end globally to a significant degree until 2022 or even into 2023. But for the advanced economies, I think we can feel increasingly confident that by the end of 2021, we'll feel like we're on the other side of the pandemic. Feel a lot much better about things, and that's key to this optimism I have for 2021. The second reason for some optimism is I do expect policymakers, global central banks, and governments to continue to be very aggressive in responding to the economy's problems. Central banks, as you know, have been very aggressive in lowering interest rates. Federal Reserve has pushed rates to the zero lower bound. We have negative interest rates in Europe and in Japan. That's not going to change anytime soon. Global central banks are now highly committed to maintaining this zero negative interest rate policy until the global economy, until their economies are back much closer to full employment. And even under my optimistic scenario, that's not going to happen for 2 or 3, 4 years. So we can expect to see very, very low, certainly short-term interest rates, the rates that central banks can control for the foreseeable future. And on fiscal policy, governments, I also expect governments to remain aggressive. Their response in 2020 was critical to keeping the global economy together as well as it was kept together, using deficit financed increases in government support spending, in some cases some tax cuts, temporary tax cuts to help support their economies. One sidebar here. If you look across the world and look to see which economies have navigated the pandemic better than others, it does boil down to really these two things. First, how well did those economies manage the healthcare crisis, the pandemic? Economies in Asia have done a pretty good job. China, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, all have managed the crisis much better, and their economies have benefited from it. And those economies that have not been able to manage the pandemic well, really much of the rest of the world, see the pandemic raging in the emerging world, in the United States, Europe, India, that those economies have suffered more. And the other key factor creating these differences in economic performance has been policy. Who's been more aggressive in responding? So, country like Australia has provided very substantive support to their economy through fiscal policy, and that shows in the performance. And countries like India have provided much less support to their economies, and that shows. The Indian economy has struggled more than many others as a result of the fact that the pandemic has been so severe, not well contained, and also because policy support has not been nearly as aggressive. So point number one is 2021 should be a much better year than 2020 when it comes to the global economy. Okay, that's the good news. Point number two, the next few months are going to be tough until we get to a place where the vaccines are being distributed in a broad-based way. The economy is global economy is going to struggle. The pandemic is raging in many parts of the world, and that is doing significant damage to economies. We saw that today. Got a data point today in the United States on jobs for the month of November, and we saw got a gain in employment, but very small gain. 250,000 jobs were added in the month of November, which in the context of the fact that the U.S. economy is still down about 10 million jobs from its pre-pandemic peak, gives you a sense of how disconcerting that is. And the sectors of the economy that are struggling are the same ones that have been struggling with the pandemic from the beginning. And now that the pandemic is re-intensifying, it's causing those businesses to start pulling back again. You know, the obvious: restaurants, leisure hospitality, recreational activities, airline industry, healthcare industry. They're all getting hit very hard again by the raging pandemic. The other factor that makes me nervous about economies in the near term is that governments are starting to turn a bit more cautious in their support. And that, again, is very evident here in the United States. We've been waiting here now for Congress and the Trump administration to come together and agree to another fiscal rescue package. You know, I had thought, given the sound economics behind another package and the politics, that we'd get this done before the election, the U.S. presidential election back about a month ago. But that did not happen. And here we are now in the lame duck session. And there's been some more positive news coming out of Washington. It feels like pressure is developing to a point where lawmakers will be able to agree to something and sign on the dotted line and provide additional support. But boy, there's a lot of risk around that. And if they don't get it together, I do think odds are pretty good that here in the US and other parts of the world, we'll start to see some job loss again and rising unemployment. I mean, here in the US, we've got a number of fiscal supports that are fading away and will completely expire by the end of the year. You know, unemployment insurance for folks affected by the pandemic. We have a rental eviction moratoria that's in place to the end of the year. If that expires, then we'll see rental evictions surge in the month of January. Student loan payments have been student loan borrowers have been on a moratorium in terms of their payments. That ends at the end of the year. There's been a number of different tax credits for businesses to help ensure that they keep workers on payroll. They expire. I can go on, but the point is the support here is fading fast. And if lawmakers can't get it together and sign on the dotted line relatively soon, then we got a problem. The economy is going to struggle, potentially start to backtrack here, and recession risks will rise. So point number two is getting from here to the vaccines is going to be difficult. The next few months are going to be tough across much of the globe. Point number three, now this is looking a little longer run on the other side of the pandemic. And I do think it's fair to say that there will be a long tail from this pandemic. There'll be a number of economic changes, structural economic changes that are going to require significant adjustment going forward. And let me quickly name three of those big changes. First is work from anywhere. This is real. This is not temporary. It's a fundamental change in the way we're going to work and live. Certainly here in the US and many other advanced economies, this is the case. I mean, just to give you a statistic to strike that point home, here in the US prior to the pandemic, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a little under 10% of the workforce worked from home on a consistent basis. In the teeth of the pandemic, when businesses were shut down back in April, 35% of Americans were working from home on a consistent basis. That's come back in, but it's now somewhere between 20 and 25%. And I suspect that's where we're going to settle. And we're going to start to see that rise again as businesses, large companies in particular, figure out all the HR issues involved and empower their people to work from anywhere. This has enormous implications for all kinds of economic activity. You know, obviously, most obviously in the real estate markets, single family housing is booming. Office markets, retail markets are struggling. But it is also going to have tremendous implications for the location of economic activity. You know, big urban centers, not that they're going away, not that they're not even going to grow, but the rates of growth are going to be slower. They're going to be diminished by this. And suburbs, exurbs, smaller cities and towns will benefit and will grow more quickly. There are many other implications, too many to go into here, but broad structural change number one is work from anywhere. Number two, I do think the globalization, the process of globalization, which was already on its back heels prior to the pandemic, will be further impaired by all this. That countries have erected proverbial border walls to protect their populations from the pandemic. Getting those walls down again is going to take time, and it's going to be slow. Resurrecting global supply chains that have been severely disrupted, disoriented is not going to be easy. Getting people back traveling and immigration flows returning to normal, investment patterns, all of that will take time. And so I do think we will see globalization on its back heels for the foreseeable future. One other point there, I know it's on people's minds, is I do think adding to that concern is the ongoing conflict between the United States and China around trade. Now, this is going to change, obviously, a bit because of the election, and the new president, President Biden, will take a somewhat different approach to China than clearly President Trump did. But I do think President Biden will remain very suspicious of China and their trade practices and protection of intellectual property, investment behavior, that kind of thing. So there's no going back here. And when you conflate the ongoing tensions between the U.S. and China over trade and globalization more broadly, with the effects of the pandemic, I think broad structural change number two will be diminished globalization going forward, at least for the foreseeable future. And then finally, one other broad trend that I do want to just quickly mention is the potential for stress, fiscal stress, sovereign with regard to sovereign debt. I do think it has been very important for governments to use all of their financial resources, deficit financed activity, to support their economies during the pandemic. I don't think they really had much choice. It was a Hobson's choice. There was no good choice. Because if they hadn't provided that support, their economies would have suffered even more and their fiscal problems even greater. So they had no options here. But, as economists are wont to say, there is no free lunch. Debt loads are now much higher across the globe, and managing those higher debt loads in the future will be more difficult. And I'll end by saying, I would not be surprised that at some point down the road, 2022, 2023, 2024, we will have some type of sovereign debt event or even crisis. So broad point number three, it's cautionary note. There will be a long tail as a result of this pandemic. It's going to take the global economy a significant amount of time to adjust and to normalize and get back to the kind of economy that we were just starting to enjoy pre-pandemic. With Devin, I took my 15 minutes and I think I got it right on the nose, and I'll turn it back to you and see where you want to take the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that clear and concise overview of the global economy. I'm actually going to pass it to the convener of this session, DC Agrawal, who has just joined us after a few technical issues. DC?
Thank you, Devin, and thank you, Mark. I appreciate the technical issues I had. I'm going through.
A little worried. I was getting a little worried, but it's good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Now, learning technology that you have to, if you're using a Safari browser, you got different challenges than everything else.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether Mark was able to, you spoke well. I could hear you briefly. And on the second session in this global economy, I'd like to now introduce Dr. Viral Acharya. Viral is a CV Star professor at the New York University School of Business and previously served as Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And July 2020, based on his speeches at the Reserve Bank, he published a very interesting book, Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India. It's a must read for anybody interested in economics, especially of India, and what kind of reforms we need. Viral is also an alumnus of IIT Bombay with a degree in electrical engineering. And I'll now turn it over to Viral, and thank you.
Great. Thank you, DC. It's always a pleasure to be in any IITP gathering. This is, I believe, a pan IIT gathering, so it's even sort of multiple times the pleasure to be talking to all the alumni from different parts of India and who have been at different IITs during their respective degrees. Let me just turn to two aspects of global economy that I'm kind of most interested in terms of risks going forward. And I would say that as a result of the global financial crisis and then now the pandemic, there have been two kinds of measures that have a commonality in the adoption since then in most parts of the world, if not all. First is that a lot of borrowers, especially corporate borrowers, have been given a soft landing by the regulators. Sometimes it has been through the banking system. So banks have been told not to recognize distressed borrowers as either stressed or in some cases even defaulted borrowers as not as non-performing assets. And essentially, the idea is that you give a little bit of cushion to these distressed sectors. Maybe that'll help preserve economic activity, jobs, etc. And then, maybe a virtuous cycle may start by then. The experience with this has been certainly mixed, if not actually negative outright. Japan in the 90s, Europe in the last decade don't seem to have got their economies back on feet with this strategy of kicking the can down the road as far as dealing with distressed borrowers is concerned. There are many terms for it. It's called evergreening of loans, or it could be even bonds if bond markets are given backstop by the central bank, as they have been since the pandemic. Sometimes it's called extend and pretend. So when debt of a distressed borrower is coming due, rather than asking for tough renegotiations, you simply roll it over, perhaps at an even more subsidized borrowing rate than before, because you don't want to recognize that the borrower is in trouble. And sometimes it's called zombie lending, because this lending is keeping these firms, which are kind of living dead, so to speak, or zombies. What is the problem with zombie lending? There's a wealth of research now on Japan as well as on Europe, which shows that this kind of lending ultimately doesn't deliver for the economy for at least two reasons. One is that these firms themselves actually don't do that well. They typically, the loans that have defaulted are of companies which have not been doing that great in terms of their cash management, productivity, relative competitiveness within the sector or globally, and that they simply hog the credit and the resources that are provided to them. And they are not able to turn themselves around in a manner that would make them comparable to healthier firms in the sector. So that's the fact that resources are getting allocated to zombie firms and they aren't displaying any significant turnaround in their investments, employment, productivity. The second important cost of zombie lending is that there are healthier firms in these sectors. And because there isn't a creative destruction of these relatively weaker firms, these healthier firms don't get their pricing power. The sector is always running at excess capacity, or sometimes what economists like to call it low capacity utilization. And in a sector where supply remains very large relative to demand, there isn't much pricing power for the firms. As a result of lack of these pricing power, even healthier firms in zombie sectors are not able to invest and employ the right amounts compared to sort of where they could be. So, as we come out of the pandemic, one of my worries is that this idea that everything will simply revert to the pre-pandemic world may not be right. I think certain sectors are undergoing fundamental shifts. It's not at all clear that the traditional fossil fuel sector is ever going to actually be the same it was. It hasn't been over the last 10 years, and it may not be going forward as well as the world does move forward on more renewable and sustainable planet-friendly solutions. Think about malls. Are we likely to keep going to the malls when e-commerce is actually picking up so much and facilitating such easy distribution of the goods that we want at our doorsteps? And third, airlines. Are we really likely to be flying to India for a Pan IIT conference at the drop of a hat rather than actually doing it through Zoom on a video conference? I think projections are that global travel may not reach back pre-COVID levels at least until 2023 or 24. So many of these sectors are likely to struggle with the debts that they have taken on because their revenues are not likely to come back to the pre-COVID levels. They've already taken a hit. And because their debts are getting extended in one form or the other by banks or through bond markets that are supported by central banks, there's going to be both a hogging of resources, a pressure on the healthier firms also not to be able to charge the right prices. And of course, this can become a very protracted cycle of 5-10 years, as we have seen in the case of Japan and Europe. So this is my first question for the global economy as we come out, say with some vaccinations in 21, 22, which is that in the post-COVID recovery phase, what is the exit plan for these policies to accommodate the highly distressed debt that we've taken on? Will we mark the bank's books in a timely manner? Will we take the support from the bond markets off in a timely manner? Will we allow for these firms to be filed in bankruptcy so that there is some natural adjustment of the supply in these sectors to the demand conditions? Or will we keep kicking the can down the road as Japan and Europe did in 90s and 2000s respectively? So that's one big risk that I would watch out for. I think the second big issue that I want to raise is that of inflation. And here I would say there is also a significant risk of disinflation, but I want to put both on the table as being two extreme scenarios that have now become more likely than in the past. And why do I say that? I'm conjecturing this, of course, and I'm saying this on the basis of the fact that both post-global financial crisis and especially since the COVID outbreak, large developed economy governments have taken on very, very substantial amounts of debt on their balance sheet. There is a lot of discussion on debt sustainability, which is not manifesting as problems in the short run, but the levels of debt look at the levels where there could be vulnerability to any further shocks. And a lot of these debt has been, in the short run, been supported by either the central banks or been supported by the fact that the world has actually cut back on consumption and investments. And so there's a lot of free savings around which are going into these government bond markets. Now, as and when growth recovers post-pandemic, at least in the aggregate, it may not be the same for every single sector that is out there. Two kinds of scenarios can arise. In one scenario, the pent-up demand of the economy as a whole comes back. The private sector credit growth also picks up. And that could create inflation impulses in the economy. This is going to coincide with an era in which corporates are likely to be diversifying their supply chains, moving away from necessarily the single lowest cost provider of imports to them in order to be somewhat resilient. There may even be an explicit decision at some national levels to move away from China. All this is going to mean further inflation impulses as we come out of this COVID phase. Now, at that time, typically, without any considerations of government debt, you would expect that these developed economy or systemically important central banks would start normalizing their liquidity and interest rate policies, withdraw the liquidity from the market, raise interest rates in order to combat inflation that may be beginning to show signs of moving above their target levels. But this time around, they are going to be confounded with an additional problem, which is that the amount of government debt that needs to be rolled over is very, very large. And if those rollovers don't happen at relatively low costs, that could mean further debt burden for these governments down the line. There could be explicit pressures on central banks to not focus on their price stability objectives, but to instead soften it for the governments in the rollover market. So short-term rates could be under pressure to be kept low. If that happens, what would be happening is called in macroeconomics as fiscal dominance, where the central bank gets dominated by the fiscal condition and starts deviating from its long-run objectives and is focused more on the rollover of government debt. It may not be an explicit default point. It could just be avoiding the risk of a downgrade of the sovereign, for example. Typically, when these scenarios have happened, a lot of emerging markets that have experienced these kinds of levels and fiscal dominance, they see runaway inflation that ultimately becomes a problem, even if the central bank accommodation is somewhat calming for the bond markets in the short run. A second scenario that can arise, though, which of course a number of emerging markets also have experience for, is that when government debt levels become very high, there is a tendency to engage in financial repression. One form of financial repression of savers is, of course, low interest rates that I was just describing. But another commonly deployed trick in emerging markets is to force banks and other financial firms in your economy to hold very large quantities of government debt. This is almost required by fiat. You can design liquidity rules, for example, that favor holdings of government bonds. You could be calling up banks before difficult auctions of government debt in order to go ahead and just buy the paper under some sort of moral suasion from the regulators. And when this happens, effectively, it raises the cost of credit for the private borrowers in the economy, because the balance sheet of the banks, insurance companies, pension funds is not as easily available for private credit creation as it is for government credit creation. And typically, therefore, these episodes of financial repression have been associated with low overall growth because the government is becoming larger and larger and the private sector is getting crowded out. Low productivity because not the most efficient projects are getting credit, but the government has become a favored borrower through the banking, insurance, pension fund system, etc. And third, these episodes can go on for a very long period of time without any problems. So the beauty of financial repression, the reason why it is so attractive for policymakers to engage in, is that this becomes a way of essentially supporting government bond markets for years, where you are killing the potential growth of the economy, but yet there is nothing like a sovereign crisis manifests, because actually you have rigged the markets to be steered in the direction of the government borrowing. So as the global economy comes out of the COVID phase with vaccinations or otherwise, to me, how will we deal with the zombie sectors that no longer look to be generating enough revenues relative to their debts? How will we deal with them? Will we enforce the right market discipline and allow for a creative destruction when that time arises, when we are recovering out of COVID? And second, what kind of central bank policies will we see, and more broadly, financial sector policies? Will they be of the nature of fiscal dominance and you see runaway inflation, or will they be of the form of financial repression, in which case you get low growth, low productivity for a while? I think these are the risks and the scenarios that everyone in markets, companies, research will have to contend with as we go along. Let me stop there with these initial remarks, DC, and happy to look at other things in the Q&A.
Thanks, Viral. I appreciate your remarks and Mark's comments too. I think at this point in time, we could have, we got a session with two more speakers. So before, I think if you can, I'm going to defer questions at this time. Just make a comment that I don't know whether Devin introduced himself or not, but I will shortly. I also wanted to add something that tomorrow morning, which is the 5th morning, we got two good speakers also going to be talking on some of the economic trends affecting India's economy, as well as we got Commerce Minister of India, Piyush Goyal, speaking at around 8:30 Pacific time. And then we have got the Honorable Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and he's current president of Asia Society Policy Institute, speaking on what's happening with the G20 and G8 and the role India, US, and other countries can play in that whole to revive the economies after COVID pandemic and the vaccine sector. So please, if you have time, now I'd like to, I don't know whether Devin introduced, he's the Chief Financial Services Editor with LinkedIn, and he worked formerly with Bloomberg. His writings have appeared in Wall Street Journal, and he has an engineering degree, not from IIT, but from Stanford. So Paul, Devin, go forward on the FinTech session. This is session 2 for those who are, I don't know, Devin got a chance to explain to you. We had the first session with Dr. Mark Zandi and Dr. Viral Acharya speaking on the global economies, what we can expect in 2021, both in US, India, and here. And in the second segment, we're going to be examining the issues in the FinTech sector, the way changes are coming and how we manage and conduct financial transactions. And for that, we have 2 very good speakers, Dr. Ashish Chauhan of Bombay Stock Exchange and Mr. Piyush Ranjan from Google Payments. So with that, on to you, Devin.
Thank you very much, DC, and thank you to our first 2 speakers. As DC said, we're going to shift gears in this second half of the hour and discuss trends in financial technology, or FinTech. This is an ecosystem that many of you know is absolutely booming. I'm going to share just a few proprietary stats here from LinkedIn before introducing the speakers. Here at LinkedIn, as many of you know, we have 722 million members or users across the globe. And looking at the FinTech evolution among those users, just looking over the past 5 years, 2015 to 2020, we have seen the amount of people, of professionals, skilling up in financial technology and listing FinTech skills on their CVs grow by 1,100% over those 5 years, so about a 12-fold increase. Searches for FinTech topics on the LinkedIn platform are up about 17-fold over those 5 years, and content creation about FinTech topics is up 9-fold from 2015. So it's clear that both the expertise and the interest and the professional conversation in FinTech is just absolutely booming, as I said. And we have 2 speakers now to break down what trends they are seeing and following most closely. The first is Ashish Chauhan. He is the CEO of Bombay Stock Exchange, Asia's oldest exchange. It's also the world's fastest exchange with a 6 microseconds response time. It's the world's largest exchange with 5,000 plus listed companies, and it was India's first universal exchange to offer trading across asset classes. Prior to BSE, Ashish was at Reliance Industries, of course, India's largest conglomerate, as president and group CIO and head of corporate communications. And my favorite stat about Ashish is he was CEO of the cricket team Mumbai Indians in its formative years. He's also, of course, an alumnus of IIT Bombay. Let's lend Ashish our undivided attention and also our virtual gratitude, as it has just turned midnight where he is in Mumbai. So Ashish, if you don't mind spending about 10, 12 minutes taking us through the trends in the financial services space in India and some trends as it relates to financial technology that you are following most closely and most excited about. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Devin. It's an honor to be in front of you. It reminds me of the late nights at IIT. And so it's not unusual for most IITians to stay awake through the nights. For us, broadly, most people are engineers in this group who are listening. So FinTech has 2 words, right? One is finance, other is technology. And technology, many of us understand inherently. Finance is something even the professors like Viral might take few hours to explain one word called finance and still may not be sufficient. But for me, for this sort of session, we can say finance has something to do with money. Anything to do with money is finance, right? And if you recall, the new technologies, in fact, the new science got invented in search of money. That was the alchemy, right? The chemistry. People were trying to search for gold to create gold, and that's how the fintech actually started in those days, searching for money, and so the new science got created. But effectively, every word which you hear in finance, whether it's central banks, mutual funds, investment banks, stock markets, trading, clearing, settlement, microfinance, payment processing, hedge funds, accounts, lending, borrowing, collaterals, insurance, private equity, venture capital, all sorts of new jargon will come to you. But I would divide it in, say, 5-6 parts in terms of what the fintech should or fintech is trying to do. One is, of course, it's in the search of manufacturing of money. Of course, the modern money is actually a figment of the imagination of few and backed by the government's power. It's called fiat money. But still, many of us want to manufacture our own money. And that's where we go after Bitcoin and so on and so forth. That's considered part of fintech or not, I don't know. But basically, manufacturing of money has always been there as part of human endeavor. The second part, which is more mundane, is what I call transaction processing of any type. Whether you are buying or selling something and you have to pay money or you have to pay stocks or anything, that's basically the transaction processing. The third portion is basically storage of that information and information processing. So you basically store that information either on your pillows, those banknotes, or you store it in bank servers, and that's basically a very important part. The fourth part is the compliance or regulation technology, or RegTech as we call it. And so each of us who are in anything to do with finance, we need to do a lot of regulations, or we have to comply with a lot of regulations. And that's where that technology is also very important for fintech. The other part, which is again a human endeavor for all these millennials or millenniums, is the prediction. How do you predict future? That is, after 1 year, what is going to happen? After 1 month, what is going to happen? After 1 second, what is going to happen? After 1 microsecond, what is going to happen? And that industry is what is pushing the fintech quite heavily. The algorithm trading, the HFT, the flash boys, if you have heard of, AI, ML, everything that gets used in this prediction business. And then, of course, the last part is how do you secure all these things, information security. So these 6 portions are what basically makes fintech anywhere in the world. India, in a way, was early pioneer in using information technology, the computers. In some ways, in early 90s, the NSE, BSE became automated in early 90s, and India, of course, took leadership in Y2K across the world. And that's where basically India has been hugely important to the world, including the banking automation. Some of the larger names in banking automation like TCS or Infosys or Oracle's actually bought a company called COSIL, Citibank operation system. And basically, these are the banking automation systems which came out of India. And India has used all sorts of technology over the last 25, 30 years, from screen-based trading. In fact, when India became screen-based, US was not screen-based in stock market trading. In 1994, when I set up NSE, New York Stock Exchange was floor-based, CMA was floor-based, and NASDAQ was phone-based. Although it used to have screen, it didn't match anything on screen. Europe was floor-based. India became automated, screen-based. And after that success of NSE and BSE, the rest of the world became automated. So in a way, India is a pioneer in terms of doing fintech as in modern world we know it. The BSE, as Devin said, we are the fastest exchange in the world. We give a response time for almost 90% of the transactions in 6 microseconds. But more than 50%, that is the median transactions, we give you around 2 microseconds response time. In 1 second, there are a million microseconds. So effectively, we give you a response of 1 by 500,000 of a second. And many of you might wonder, who are not into finance, saying, why do you require such fast response? Because human eyes cannot see. Today, almost more than 90% of all orders on Indian stock markets are thought about by the computers, by the algorithms. And they are called HFT, high frequency trading, or algorithm trading. And we do settlement on T+2 basis. We also, in many areas, we do settlements on T plus few seconds basis. Not many countries in the world, including US, can do what we do in India, because we are completely automated, end to end, from central bank to the commercial bank to the stock exchanges. Everything is completely automated. Today we have around 65 million investors registered with us, and if we were a country, we would be in probably top 15 countries in the world. And out of the 65 million, 13 million were added in last 1 year alone. And still we have not reached even 3.5% of India's population. So we have a long way to go. We also use automation for mutual fund distribution through exchanges, insurance distribution. The more interesting parts on the banking side is something called RTGS, real-time gross settlement. The Reserve Bank of India, which is a central bank, actually runs a real-time large value end-to-end transaction processing for everyone, from any bank account to any bank account in the country, from any bank to any bank. And that is basically a central bank running. I don't think in most countries in the world, including US, the central banks run any such service. And that has been there for pretty much 10-15 years, and now it has been made 24/7. Similarly, for small amounts, it's called NSEH or eNSEH, and both are running 24/7. The more interesting parts of what is now known as fintech or non-commercial transactions, that is from me to you, individual to individual, or business to individual, or individual to business. What you do in PayPal, India has a framework called UPI. It's a central switch which is owned by public banks as a trust, and literally everyone can send even 1 rupee, that is 1/100th of a dollar, to anyone else in any bank account or any mobile with zero cost to the user for last several years. And this month, that is in November 2020, India crossed 2.2 billion such transactions in a month, and probably December it will cross 2.5 billion such transactions. So it's pretty much not WeChat. It's not government organized monopoly. It is actually a switch which allows any bank, any mobile, any wallet to transfer money to any other wallet in any other bank in any other place, right? So with complete clarity, complete complete cleanliness, and without cost to the user. It's nowhere in the world this kind of infrastructure of fintech for very, very small payments actually take place. 1/100th of a dollar, right? That's 1 cent. And if you have to send money in anywhere, it's going to cost a lot of lot of money to send that money or receive the money. And this is basically, as I said, it's from any mobile to any mobile, any account to any account, any bank to any bank. And similarly, for almost 700 million bank accounts, a single unique ID which is linked to the mobile number of that person, and the Aadhaar, which is the social security number with biometrics, including the thumbprints and iris biometrics, is available. So it's called Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Trinity, where Jan Dhan is a bank account, and India probably a couple of years back, before Mr. Modi came in 2014, had probably 25 crore, that's 250 million accounts. Now it's almost 3 times that account, so 750 million bank accounts, all of them connected this way. So you know who you are sending the money to and how much. And similarly, the largest bank in India is called SBI, State Bank of India, which runs a completely automated mobile-based system called YONO. India also invented many things on the run, like the PIN number, which is fixed for debit card or credit card transactions in US. We have our OTP, one-time password, which you would have used today in the IIT2020 login. You would have got password in your email. And that is basically Indian innovation, where you have the PIN, you have the credit card number or a debit card number, but over and above that, for every transaction, you get a separate variable PIN, which is ensured that the poorest of poor and the remotest places are able to actually transact without being worried about somebody hacking their numbers or somebody taking away their hard-earned money by hacking into their credit card numbers and so on and so forth. So India is pretty much doing many things which not many countries can dream of. and it is done in a more cooperative, more competitive, at the same time sort of way. India also, especially during the COVID period, when on March 22nd, Mr. Modi decided to close down or have a lockdown for India for 70 days, within 1 minute of his or 1 second of his speech getting over, I wrote that BSE will work normally tomorrow. It was Sunday, and I wrote at evening, probably it was around 8 o'clock after his speech, saying BSE will run normally. And I started getting inundated by phone calls and messages from brokers, from media saying, what are you doing? Everyone is going to die. You want to run exchange. And that's how we have been able to run these exchanges, all the banking system across the country. But more importantly, we ran India, but we also ran the banks of the world. Almost every bank worth its name, every financial institution which is large, including mutual funds, insurance companies, all of them have their back office, their software development centers in India. And despite those 70 days of lockdown and then later on many lockdowns, India ran itself, but India ran the world. So for me, fintech is a democratizing agent, and India is done wonderfully well. And over a period, India has kind of led the world in many of this thinking about the fintech. I'm sure probably US will learn a lot. We have learned a lot from US, especially the technology part, but how to use it smartly at very low cost is what India has taught the world. And with there, probably I'll tell you one more interesting things. If you have not watched a television serial, that with the fintech fraud has also gone mainstream in India. There is a TV, sort of a web serial called Jamtara. If you have not watched it, watch it. I will also recommend to Piyush. With that, I think I'll hand over to Piyush for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashish. Fantastic remarks. Very clear that India has been a leader, perhaps the leader, in fintech innovation. If you think about it, that is very impressive. Those stats and the pace of development and innovation there. So Ashish, thank you again for joining us. I know now it is almost 12:30 a.m. in India, so please go enjoy the start to your weekend. And with that, we are going to introduce Piyush Ranjan. He's Vice President of Engineering at Google. Piyush leads the payments organization as well as Google's Next Billion Users initiative. He has also led various engineering teams within Google, including Google Mobile, Enterprise, and Search. And before Google, Piyush was VP of Infrastructure at Airbnb and CTO at Flipkart. And he is an alumnus, of course, of IIT Kharagpur. So Piyush, thank you very much for joining us. Why don't we turn it over to you for some of your high-level thoughts on fintech innovation and evolution that you are following most closely and, in fact, working on with your sleeves rolled up at Google right now.
Oh, thank you, Devin, for that introduction, and thank you, Ashish. Actually, I wanted to say I hail from Bihar, and yes, I have seen Jamtara. It is interesting in this day and age that we can actually be connected through the internet in these COVID times. I also want to say that I agree with everything which Ashish said about fintech. I'll try to paint a parallel picture for you. Talking about internet, do you remember the time just a few decades ago? And I know half of you are students, so you probably don't remember that time, but the age before the internet, right? So let's say you wanted to find an answer to a question at that time. You'd have to go to the nearest library, dust out an encyclopedia or a book on the topic, and maybe find what you're looking for. The whole process was expensive in effort. The amount of knowledge you could access was limited, and all this was available only to a privileged section of society that had library access, right? Now you fast forward to today, there are billions of people around the world with knowledge of world in their pockets. All they have to do is pull out the phone, type in a few words into Google, and they can get any of their questions answered. Now, what has made this possible was the internet revolution. And what I want to talk to you about is that there is such a revolution coming. It is in the field of money. I mean, Ashish has referred to a lot of innovations which are happening. Let me paint a picture of how it is going on. So the reason the information became so easily accessible out from those printed books into your palm is because of three main reasons. Number one was there was digitization of content. There was internet connectivity, more and more available, and a lot of people had smartphones. Now, I personally have been fortunate enough to work on two of these problems. I worked on search, I worked on low-cost Android devices like Moto G, which a lot of people in India used. Now we are seeing that with the same connectivity and the same smartphones, an increasing digitization of our lives and money and the prediction algorithms and things like that, there's an opportunity which is there ripe for fintech. Now you might say, what is wrong with money? It works just fine. And for most of us, money works just fine. But then again, people could access library, but that was a small segment of society. Let's take some examples from India. It might work well for you, but you remember the time when you would take an auto and the autowala would not have chutta for 100 rupee note, right? Now it was a matter of inconvenience for you, but it was a matter of livelihood for the other person. Today, things are different. I went to India in 2018 and I picked up a taxi at the airport, which was not a prepaid taxi. And when we got to the hotel, I realized I had no Indian rupees to give him. And I was going to ask the receptionist, and the driver himself said, do you have Paytm or Google Pay? And obviously, I was happy to hear that, given I work on Google Pay. But the result was we were done within seconds, and it was so smooth. Life for that taxiwala got better rather than wait and all the other hassles which come along. Or the other example I'll give you is in India, you know that we have these cleaning ladies who go from house to house cleaning houses during the day. So a colleague of mine in Bangalore, her maid told her one day, without knowing that she works on Google Pay, said, "Madam, can you please pay this month's salary in Google Pay? I have to go to 2 more houses after this." And it struck me that what we thought was a matter of giving cash and convenience of using the phone was a matter of security for her, right? Like any one of us, imagine getting your monthly salary in cash given by your boss and you're walking around all day doing various chores before you go home, right? The amount of stress it'll create on you will be higher. So that is another example of how money was hard for people and getting better. Couple of examples from US, a construction worker who gets paid every 2 weeks, runs out of cash in 12 days, and takes a 400% interest rate payday loan for 2 days. I mean, look at this person. This person has worked 12 out of the 14 days, but still cannot access that cash and has to take a predatory loan to run their household. When I came to US as an international student, by all statistical measures, I was expected to live a middle class or better life. Yet, when I applied for a credit card, it was impossible to get one. I got many free t-shirts, but I didn't get a single credit card. This is a situation which foreign students face, new immigrants into countries face, newly divorced single moms face all the time, because there's no credit history, you cannot get access to credit. Now let's talk about credit card a little bit more because it is a very popular form of money movement. It is a highly insecure form of payment. If you bought something from me using a credit card, you would have to give me everything that is needed to so I can turn around and impersonate you to somebody else. My wife a couple of years ago went to a local store to buy biryani. She gave the cashier the credit card. He went back in the kitchen, came back with the food and the card and gave it to her. Turns out he went out the back door to the Sprint store next door and bought 2 cell phones. Now, we only knew because we were looking at the statement few weeks later and we found, whoa, what's this? And later we found out it was that store because that store accepts only cash, which we didn't know at that time. But why was the cashier able to impersonate my wife? It is because that is what the physical card security model is. And notwithstanding, this is in the US, I agree, in India, it is much better. The OTP examples, it's great. Plus you get notification when your card gets used, that's fantastic. But here is the other issue. We went ahead and disputed that purchase. The credit card company asked us not to pay. They did not charge us, but who do you think paid for those phones? Because the phones were gone. It was the merchant next door. What happens is I charge the thing, I dispute the charge. They say, okay, hold on. They tell the merchant, and now while they're resolving, the merchant does not get the money. It comes out of their working capital. What do you think that does to small businesses, right? And while we're talking about small businesses want to raise more working capital. That loan process is lengthy and can take weeks. If a business wants to offer its customers some credit, like Macy's has its own store card or Kohl's or Nordstrom, it's not possible for every small business to do that. Or create loyalty programs like frequent flyers, or have like airlines have these mileage credit cards. You get this card which is branded with the airline. All of those things are out of reach for majority of the businesses in the world. But we believe that digitization of finance can help solve all of these problems in a better way. Now, the question is, how can it help? What are the trends which we are seeing? As I mentioned earlier, there are some very good trends. More and more people are carrying smartphones thanks to rapidly decreasing cost of lower-end phones. You might think, wait, my latest iPhone keeps increasing in price every year, but we are talking about the billions of people who are carrying low-end phones. That is their only computer. More and more people are connected to internet through these phones because the cost of data is coming down. In India, actually, the cost of data is the lowest in the world, and per capita data consumption is the highest in the world. The value of connecting to the internet is increasing everywhere in the world. There are more smartphones in the world than number of people. More and more people are becoming comfortable using phone for financial purposes, thanks to explosion of e-commerce and mobile banking. And lastly, more and more information about the customer base is becoming easier to analyze, and behaviors are becoming easier to predict. As Ashish said, this reduces risk and cost in financial services, thereby increasing the number of people who can be served and the services that we can offer them. So there are a couple of other things which are happening in addition to these trends, which are really signs that the future for fintech is here. First of all, high quality digital rails are emerging for moving money between accounts. By rails for moving money, I mean systems equivalent to ACH, check clearing process in USA, or bank-to-bank wire transfer, or like RGTS in India, or what credit card networks do. And as mentioned earlier, one of the most successful national rails created anywhere in the world is UPI in India. Now, if you look at UPI, I think statistic was number of orders is 2.2 million in November. But the funny thing is that I have the October number, 189 banks are plugged into this network, and it did 50 billion worth of transaction in October alone. Now, at a run rate basis, 50 billion a month is 22% of India's GDP. So just think about how big that is. And that is enabled through these digital rails. We are seeing this as something which is coming up in other countries as well, who are looking to adopt or mandate such rails, including USA is also looking at that. Brazil is also looking at it. So one of the things which is helping this kind of adoption get really fast, in addition to all the banks being connected, is on top of it, you can have a lot better authentication and authorization. You know, most of the time you're operating them using the phones. The security of the smartphone is something you can layer on top of this. Biometric authentication, you will see in Apple Pay, Google Pay, it requires you to have a Face ID or a thumbprint or a PIN. All of these things are available as a layer of security on top of whatever else you're doing, making these payment mechanisms very secure. For tap and pay credit cards, which you like tap your phone onto an NFC terminal in many countries, a unique card number that is valid only when it is coming from your phone is created when your card is installed onto the phone or provisioned onto the phone. Now, such a level of security makes it impossible for the recipient to impersonate you when they receive your card number. There is virtually no chance of spoofing you unless they have control of your device itself. And when you do that kind of check and balance, it has downstream effect for everybody. Everybody has benefit. Now, in addition to fast way of moving money, and in addition, high quality authentication authorization, we are now starting to see more financial services appear. To begin with, it's much speedier to fill out a loan application. We have launched services in India where users are able to get loans granted instantly inside the payment app. What could take weeks now can be done in seconds. That kind of access is really improving people's life. Secondly, there are many companies which are using information outside your past credit history to give you cards. There's a company in US called Deserve, which actually gives cards to students and the immigrants and the ones who do not have a good credit history. Goldman Sachs and Axel have invested in them. I'm sure when I was a new student, if I had applied to them, they would have given me a generous credit limit. I don't know if it would have been a good thing for me financially, but I would have really enjoyed it in those days. But they're doing that. Offering credit at the point of purchase is no longer only for large companies. There's a company called Affirm here, which is making very small merchants offer the same convenience through simple online integration. Payday loans are another example. There are banks here like Chime, which are offering, these are neobanks offering access to your paycheck 2 days ahead of time if you get paid via direct deposit. So because there's a lot more information which they can understand, and then they can predict things. So to recap, what is happening is digitization is allowing innovation at every level. At the lowest level, we have way to move money fast. Then we have security and authorization. Then we have a lot of different kind of data sets available, which can be used to understand things. And then on top of that, a whole kind of services are coming. Now, this is just the beginning. Our bet is that each of these layers will evolve at its own pace and become more and more innovative, and new layers of functionality will appear. For those of you who did networking class in college, you know that internet architecture has 7 layers of functionality that came together to the magic happen, which we are here looking at on the computer. Digital money will also be built that way. There'll be layers of functionality and everything will evolve at its own rate and a lot of things will happen. Now, this does not mean everything is clear. We still have a lot to do. We still have to evolve the right privacy preserving data sharing standards so the user is in control of their data, because that will actually dictate access to finances. We still have to upgrade the regulations to allow innovation without, while preventing abuse. The regulations of today are not always designed for fintech world. We still have to ensure that increased digitization does not further amplify the impact of digital divide. You know, there are a lot of people who have smartphone and internet, but there are a lot of people who do not. But all of us, the technology companies, the financial institutions, the regulators, we all have to work together and bring together towards this goal. So the future is very bright. Just like when we were going to the library to find the encyclopedia and we had not imagined that we'll be sitting here and talking like this. Similarly today, while we still have pieces of paper money in our pocket, it is hard to imagine what we'll be able to do with money in future. But I'm very optimistic there'll be a lot of good for a lot of people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piyush. We have a few minutes and we have so many questions actually coming in for you in particular. And so I'd like to just pose one to you in our remaining few minutes, which is, as you said, many students are joining us, many early career professionals as well, who are very excited about trying to work in the fintech ecosystem, but they see traditional financial institutions trying to innovate. They see big tech innovating like you and your team are doing so well. They see startups innovating and trying to disrupt as well. What do you see as the role of, call it big tech for lack of a better term, but of which Google is a member? What do you see philosophically the role of big tech in the fintech ecosystem? Does it replace traditional financial players or does it augment what they do?
It definitely augments. That is the way we look at it. We feel like we have a lot of learning from information age, but money and printed words on books are not the same thing. There is a lot good which we can bring along, but we fully are interested in working within the regulatory framework of every country with the right financial institutions and partners. You might have heard we have announced that in US, for example, we are partnering with Citibank and Stanford Credit Union and others to provide a whole other way to do banking. Partnership is built into our core. When we did, if you look at UPI, if you look at the adoption curve, as Google Pay launched, the adoption took off. We brought our know-how of how to bring consumers to a product, and we worked with banks, like we worked with Access Bank, and SBI, and ICICI, and everybody. We worked with the banks, we worked with the NPCI, we worked with the Indian government. We did all of that to make sure that things work for the society. So absolutely, that's how I see us doing things.
Fascinating. Well, Piyush Ranjan, VP of Engineering at Google, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and the exciting work that you and the team are doing at Google.
Sure, thank you for having me.
And so just a fantastic slate over the past 70 minutes, of course, touching on the global economy, the US economy, innovation in the financial system in India, as well as all of the exciting work that Google and other tech players are adding to this fintech ecosystem. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to the convener of this session, DC.
Thank you, Devin, and thank you, Piyush. It's really been the session when we're planning, we're trying to figure out, and you've touched so many different things which are going to affect our lives in the near future. Something which we never imagined, probably when we were in college. And I don't even know what the prediction is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years where things will go. But obviously, it'll be for the better and improve our everyday lives. So thanks again. And with that, I'd like to close this session. And as a reminder, as I said before, if you're interested in subject of global economy, please hear the 2 keynote addresses tomorrow morning from Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal and Kevin Rudd of Asia Policy Institute and the former Prime Minister of Australia. They're very, very thoughtful remarks and a lot to chew on for this group. With that, I'd like to end the session, and I'll ask people to go to the keynote tab for the at 11:20 PST time. And I'd also like to thank the EEQ team for doing everything. And I'm sorry for my faux pas on not being able to sign on time. Thank you very much.